Thanks for tuning in to the HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda. The HR Uprising is focused on helping forward-thinking people professionals deliver real lasting value in their organisations. I'm a chartered psychologist, speaker and trainer, and recently authored the best-selling business book, How to Be a Change Superhero. My day job is founder and CEO of software and training business Actus. This gives me the opportunity to work with other businesses like yours. We are focused on building a better workplace for people wherever they are located, with the help of our performance, learning and talent management software and our training and consultancy services. Every week on the podcast, I will be covering different topics and challenges, joined by relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy and get value from this week's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast. And I'm really pleased to have this week's guest because I think today's topic is so important to everybody out there. So I've got the CIPD Senior Reward Advisor, Charles Cotton, with me today, and we're going to focus in on the issues around the cost of living crisis and what can we do in an HR capacity to help people out. Charles, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So I know you've actually done lots of research into this, Charles, haven't you? And as that we're actually going to signpost people to the CIPD's hub on the cost of living crisis, and there's lots of really useful materials. But I suppose just starting off here, how big an issue do you see this cost of living crisis to be for HR and for people that are our employees?
Well, certainly it's a very big issue, and it's also a very complex issue. I mean, it's caused by many factors. I mean, some of the ones that are often quoted in the media are, the war in Ukraine, this disruption to the supply chain caused by COVID. We've had labour shortages. Extreme weathers has caused problems for food production. And more recently, we're seeing falls in the value of in the currency, and it's not just happening in the UK. And of course, there are many parties who also have a role to play, such as employers, government, employees, financial services, unions. However, I suppose it makes sense, given our audience, to focus on what employers can do in the UK.
Yes,
and that's what hopefully we'll be talking about.
Yeah, I mean, the whole sort of thing about, I think we've been through times as well with low inflation for an awfully long time, and therefore that the classic cost of living pay increase isn't necessarily something that employers have kind of carried on doing. I think in lots of places they haven't necessarily felt able to. And now with very high inflation, it feels like, should we all be doing cost of living increases?
One of the differences between now and the financial crash back in 2008, 2000 is that employers could say, we can't afford to give you a pay rise. We're going to have to freeze pay, or we're going to have to cut it slightly. But inflation was falling, interest rates were falling. That's not a situation at the moment. And the labour market is very tight, and the challenge is if organisations can't increase pay, then some employees, will move jobs. However, as you well know, I'm sure you've covered in other podcasts, there are other motivations and reasons to join and stay an organisation, including pay. Pay is important, but there are lots of other issues as well. So when we talk about how organisations can tackle in work poverty, of course we talk about pay, but we also talk about fairness in how decisions are made and about openness and transparency. We also talk about opportunities for in-work progression, so people feel that they can develop their skills and experience and their knowledge so they can progress through the organisation, as well as the benefits that the organisation is able to provide. These may be non-financial or what's often termed as non-financial benefits, such as flexible working, hybrid working, those types of approaches, as well as things like, occupational sick pay, a staff canteen. And I think we may be touching on it later in this podcast, but perhaps focusing on those benefits that can have a big impact for those employees who are low wage, because they spend quite a lot of their money on things like accommodation, on food, on transport, childcare. So any benefits in those areas will have a good impact for them.
So that's I mean, those are all really relevant, aren't they? And I think, yeah, great if you can afford to fund a pay rise, all brilliant. But you're coming up there with some really quite useful suggestions then that you might recommend. I mean, should we drill into those in a little bit more detail? There might be things that people haven't heard of or haven't thought of. So almost sort of total reward package as to what to keep people.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps before I go into some of the detail, it might be worth saying that I suppose there is a business case for spending more on your employees, because we know that poor financial well-being has consequences both for employees and potentially employers. So a recent report that we commissioned, the CIPD commissioned, explores the impact that money worries can have on employee well-being, and finds that they can have a negative impact on mental and physical health, which can then affect their work performance. Now, one way it can affect their work performance is through absence, either because people take time off to deal with these worries or they're too stressed to come to work. And another is that it can cause presenteeism. People still work, but because of their money worries, they aren't fully functioning. For example, they could be suffering from fatigue because they've lost sleep worrying about their finances, or they spend work time trying to sort out their cash problems. So not only do money worries affect employee well-being, they can also affect employee and organizational performance. So there is, to a certain extent, a business case or a moral case for organizations to think about what can we do to improve the financial well-being of our employees. But as I said, money is important, but there are other aspects as well.
I mean, I suppose, thinking of us as HR professionals in an organization, it's making that business case when money might be tight within that it's about the sort of long-term gains, isn't it? It's easy to think, oh, right now we haven't got the money, but what you're saying is, the cost of recruiting people, if we lose them, you don't necessarily realize the impact of not doing these things. So we've really got to help convince the people with the purse strings of how vitally important it is to again look at well-being, to show people that we value them. I suppose there's going to be something about it's something about being open and honest and actually upfront with people and communicating, trying to solve the problem together. Would you advocate getting side by side with people to try and solve the problems?
Well, again, I think that goes back to what we were talking about earlier around the importance of fairness. When we've asked employees in the past what's important to their financial well-being, obviously pay came out as being important, but also the fairness of reward decisions, people being given pay rises fairly or promotions fairly and bonuses fairly. So it's important for organizations to think about that, about how do they communicate to employees why they're getting paid, what they're getting paid, what the organization needs to achieve to be able to give them, a pay rise or a bonus. How do their pay compared to others in the organization? How is it compared to people outside the organization? And to a certain extent, a lot of pay transparency is already happening, possibly outside the organization's control, because you're starting to see more information being shared through social media. It's appearing on various websites where you talk about, your employer, the experience of your organization in terms of pay and benefits. So the information is out there anyway. So it's important for organizations to kind of recognize that and say, well, how can we kind of own the narrative around this? And as you say, it makes sense for them to be talking to employees and getting their feedback and saying, do you understand what we're trying to achieve? And also taking their ideas and thoughts into consideration as well.
Yeah, so involving them I think if we talk to people about it, often being upfront about things does help, I think, in terms of that. But your whole concept there of making sure that we've got a strategic and a fair way of supporting people, they see that the reward is rolled out in a fair way is critical to motivation and morale, again, I suppose, in terms of retention. One of the
Yeah,
things that I was thinking about was, you mentioned, you touched on it earlier, was the maybe having a different approach depending on the type of industry or business that you are. Because if you've got lots of minimum wage people, you may need to be more practical, because I think the impact is greater, isn't it? Do you want to talk a little bit about maybe different approaches for certain demographics or organizations?
yeah. I mean, I think, as you said, as you allude to, there's no one size fits all approach. So employers need to understand what the challenges that people are facing, so that they can think about possible solutions. And they should also explore what help they can provide through pay and what help they can provide through benefits. So in terms of low wage staff, then obviously paying them a living wage is going to be helpful. And last week we heard that the Living Wage Foundation kind of announced that a rate of £10.90 an hour across the UK. Now, in theory, paying a living wage can give you benefits over employers that don't, which could help cut the costs of increasing pay, such as better employee financial well-being, brand reputation, employee engagement. So by paying more, you can get better organizational performance, though the most common reasons often for adopting the voluntary living wage, when we've talked to employers about this, is that they feel it's the fair or right thing to do.
Yeah.
Now, another way of being able to afford to give higher wages is to increase organizational performance, so that you can afford to pay your employees more. And I suppose this approach is often called smart working. And it looks at how jobs, tasks, and the organization are designed to see where improvements can be made. And that can boost employee performance and effectiveness, and that can then be used to increase pay. But, as you said, there are other ways we can think about it. So, for instance, the government has recently scrapped the 1.25 percentage point increase in employer NICs. So perhaps you could use that to fund, help fund the pay, or perhaps pay a bonus, or give benefits. Other organizations are perhaps thinking about bringing forward the annual pay rise. So instead of having it in January, they might bring it forward to November. Or if it's in April, they might bring it forward to December or January, so people get the pay earlier. Another way of increasing productivity is offering people more hours, which can be used to increase their pay. Now, this approach can help those who either don't have the opportunity to work extra hours that they need, i.e. they're underemployed, or the opportunity is there. It's just that there are barriers preventing them from working extra hours, such as childcare or elder care. So in this case, HR needs to look at how these barriers could be overcome, such as we mentioned before, flexible working. However, the data shows that the overall number of people wanting to work extra hours is actually at quite low levels now. I think lowest since 2008.
There's more
But,
of a push towards 4-day weeks, isn't there, rather than
yes. And also, if people work for longer, then potentially, if it's not properly managed, then their welfare and their well-being will slump. But look out in your organisation. There may be people who could want, who could want to work extra hours, and if you've got the extra hours, that might be one way of helping them. You've got other areas of things like giving people shares in the company. If the company does well, then the shares will be worth more and the employees will be wealthier. However, I suppose it's fair to recognise it's going to take a few years for the shares to go up in value. And
that's quite a good way of tying people into loyalty. I'm not sure whether or not it will help them their cost of living just yet.
Well, that's the thing, is at the media, you could say, well, at the moment, we can't give you a pay rise, but we can give you shares, or we can give you a share of future profits. But as you say, for some, it may be they need the money now. And one of the things that many organizations are thinking about, and some have already done so, is giving them a kind of a lump sum bonus to help with the cost of living. We've seen various organizations in the retail sector and in the finance sector giving them staff bonuses, which is great. However, you've got to think about that for those getting universal credit or tax credits, such a bonus could interfere with their benefit payments.
Oh, blimey, it's a minefield. So you're giving people money and actually, and then it's counterproductive.
So I mean, what you need to do, again is thinking, well, what options can you do? So some organizations are thinking about giving people gift vouchers in lieu of payments, cash payments. There are tax implications with that. Or instead of giving the people a lump sum bonus all in one go, giving employees the option to kind of take that in monthly installments. And that will have less of an impact potentially on people's universal credit or tax credit claims. But of course, it's going to be tricky for employees who are getting those to make an informed estimate of what impact a bonus could have their eligibility, because usually their universal claim is at the household level. So right. HR teams need to kind of signpost to citizens' advice, so employees know where to go to get the information or the, I suppose, experience and advice on what options would best suit them if they were going to kind of take it as a lump sum or decide to take it in installments.
Are there any sort of tax-free or tax-friendly tips that you've got that people could look into that worth thinking about?
Well, there are, but again, you need to kind of think about also the kind of the cost to the organization, and also the benefit to the employee as well. It may be that there may be tax benefits, but the employee may not value the benefit that's been provided to them, even though it's cost effective for the organization in terms of tax. Right. So, I mean, I think what often makes more sense is to think about segmenting your employees and thinking about what you can provide for them. So when it comes to things like benefits, for instance, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation has identified that low-waged employees spend proportionally more of their income on, I suppose, certain things like housing and utilities, groceries, transport, and childcare. So it could make sense for organizations to focus in on those. And also because of economies of scale, it can cost employers less to buy these staff benefits than it would be for staff to buy themselves. So for example, compare the cost in terms of money and time of workers to kind of buy or make their own lunch to what it would cost the employer to do that. So again, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation with things like looking at travel costs, how to reduce food costs, etc. And a lot of this is kind of in the blog that you mentioned earlier, yeah, and on the hub. But things like letting people work from home more often, if the job allowed, that would help reduce travel costs. Allowing people who work, who come to work to travel by, who use public transport to come to work when it's cheaper, after peak hours.
Yeah.
Providing a free minibus or coach to transport people to their workplace, facilitating carpools, providing interest-free loans to buy public transport season tickets, bikes or cycles. Again, they can be quite tax efficient. Joining the government's backed cycle to work scheme, which again is tax efficient. Offering, I suppose if you're going to offer people, join the scheme or offer loans to people to get a bike, then it makes sense to offer them places to store that bike or their cycle. Providing shower facilities for those who cycle to work or run to work. Paying staff travel expenses as quickly as possible, or providing them with a credit card for travel expenses. I mean, that's just some of the few in that area that organisations consider.
Yeah, they're practical, aren't they? The point you made earlier about subsidising meals or being able to support people in that category, is that something that would be taxable? Usually, is there a way of that not being taxable?
No. You if you look at the government website, there are rules. I mean, if you were to kind of spend 40 or 50 pounds per head on people for their lunch every day, then the HMRC might be a bit suspicious. But most, you buy in bulk, and a lot of these meals can be provided for £3 or £4 a head, which is a lot cheaper than people themselves. The same things like minibuses. Again, it's cheaper for the organization to do that. But again, you have to ensure that HMRC doesn't think that, well, actually, this is kind of disguised remuneration. They're all being picked up in a Rolls Royce, thing like that, but it's unlikely.
Yes, yeah. So there's various things like that which we can have. One of the things that is interesting, the whole idea of being able to work from home, and lots of people wanting to carry on working from home. Obviously, we had the change due to COVID, but of course now with heating and costs of being at home going up, I've spoken to 3 people today on various Teams calls, all of which have got blankets on them as we're getting a bit chillier. It's an interesting one, isn't it? Almost. I know there is a small amount that goes towards heating. I think there's a tax-free allowance of £6 a week or something that you're allowed to pay people. But you can almost see where people might see that although they're saving their money on commuting, actually it's costing them. They might want to come into the office because they don't have to heat it. I don't know whether there's anything there in terms of a shift in mindset.
Well, again, I mean, many people now have smart meters, so they can perhaps do the calculation. So I spend this amount on energy and in a day. So this is how much it would compare to come into the office. And of course, then you have these trade-offs because these are increasingly the environmental concern. Many people's homes aren't particularly fuel efficient compared to their homes. To their offices. So it'd make more sense from that perspective to come in the office. But actually, then you think about the cost of traveling and the cost of and the time as well of spent commuting, then it becomes less of an appealing prospect. And one of the things that we're exploring is what more could employers do in terms of offering benefits that could help people insulate their homes.
Yeah.
So things like double glazing, insulation itself, energy efficient heating, etc., etc. Could those perhaps be provided through a salary sacrifice arrangement? Obviously, you'd have to get HMRC agreement or government agreement for that, but it could be something that the government would obviously see as being beneficial. And even if you can't, perhaps, if the government's not going to go down that road, it's still something that the employers might be able to negotiate on behalf of their employees, cheaper deals than they would necessarily be able to get themselves. So when it comes to things like insulation or double glazing, for instance.
Gosh, it's interesting. So it's really, we're almost challenging the employer to think beyond what would have been the previous remit, if you like, of where you might typically try and support people get involved. You'd leave like house stuff to the individual. You wouldn't go anywhere near it. But actually, with the whole working from home and the challenges, that's going above and beyond in many ways, or certainly into different realms that you wouldn't have thought of before.
No, I think perhaps what's happened is COVID and the experience of that kind of encouraged or pushed organizations to think more creatively about the well-being of their employees. And now we've moved from, unfortunately, straight after a medical emergency to a financial emergency. Organizations are also thinking, well, what are the lessons that we learned from supporting our staff during this period to how we can apply to this new crisis that they're facing?
Yes. And I suppose things like the childcare, there were various things like childcare vouchers and stuff were there before. Those were important. And there were a few things, but maybe not everybody capitalised on it. So perhaps looking at the area, the benefits that are tax efficient, that are there for people, and just making the most of, like you said, the bike scheme, the childcare vouchers, all those sort of things have been around for quite a long time. But not all employers actually utilise them, do they? So being able to make sure that we are maximising the opportunity for people to save tax, save money.
Well, I think this is not only just the employers also looking around for what they can do, but also communicating to staff what they are already doing.
Yes.
Often you hear people getting to financial distress, not realizing actually the organization had various benefits on offer to try and prevent these problems from arising in the first place. So, for instance, having an employee assistance program that could perhaps give them support or help, or putting them in touch with the benefit provider that the organisation was using, as well as perhaps directing people externally as well to people like the Citizens Advice Bureau, who we talked about earlier, or the Money and Pension Service. All of these are useful sources of information. But as you said, also about benefit take-up, letting people know what benefits there are and how they could be valuable to individuals, so that they do sign where they need to sign or what they need to do to get hold of them. And potentially also using the opportunity to highlight the support that you can get from the state. And, often we know that billions of pounds billions of pounds aren't used. The government sets aside this amount of money for various things like universal credit or housing credit, etc. And not everybody who's eligible actually claims it. So the organisation could say, well, help people to claim what they are eligible for. Well, you just talked about childcare vouchers, which have been phased out and replaced by tax-free childcare. The kind of the new arrangement. So it may be that employers could help their employees claim for those. So if they're kind of being put off from claiming from those benefits because the admin, the bureaucracy that's involved, perhaps the organisation could say, well, we'll take you through step by step and make it easier
for them to do it.
To claim.
Really practical things. Also making sure that people don't suffer in silence, because it could be really embarrassing, even though it's a difficult. So making sure that people will come and ask for support and help. If you've got sort of emergency assistance people may not know about and they might be too embarrassed to ask. So being approachable.
Well, yes, I mean one opportunity that we encouraged organisations to take advantage of is the Money and Pension Services Talk Money Week, which is in November. And one of the reasons that the Money and Pension Service has this is to kind of break down the stigma of talking about financial issues and money issues in the workplace. So people feel more open about talking about financial issues and worries and approaching either their colleagues or their line managers and HR about asking for help. Now, it's important, if you're kind of going down that route, that HR gives support to their line managers. So line managers are able to direct people to sources of information and guidance, and also to know where the boundary lies between giving people, guiding people with their problems compared to giving them financial advice, which, as you know, is a regulated activity.
Yes. So it's treading that, being helpful but without overstepping the mark. So, I mean, all of these are really useful, practical things that some come with health warnings, some it's about referring people. The CIPD, you've got this cost of living crisis hub, haven't you? What can you tell us a little bit about this, how people can find it and what it will offer?
Well, yeah, basically, if you go to the CIPD website or Google CIPD cost of living, and it's basically a hub which has various resources to help employers think about how they can tackle or support their employees deal with the cost of living crisis. So it looks at what other organizations are doing. It has links to the blog, which we mentioned earlier. Over time we'll be adding more to it, things like webinars and podcasts, as well as articles, or to kind of give an idea of what are the different things you can do. So money is important, but it's not necessarily just money. There's other things that organizations can think about. such as, as you said, just having a conversation. Again, because this is a multifaceted problem, you've got to think about the language we use. So low-waged workers are probably quite used to living on a budget, being quite savvy financially. However, the sudden increase in inflation and interest rates, I think is probably for many middle earners and higher earners, come as a nasty surprise. So they may need information and guidance about budgeting, as well as various tips about the ways that they can reduce how much they spend on both essential and non-essential items.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? That's in terms of hitting people in different earnings. It's not just the lower wage ones. It's the shock. So some of the middle or even higher earners may have massive mortgages on variable rates, which suddenly their disposable income is dramatically changing.
Well, yes, they may have had 5 or perhaps 7-year fixed deals, which are now coming to an end, perhaps at the worst possible time. So
yes,
yeah, and also some people perhaps didn't expect the financial issues that were going to happen, had happened. And I suppose that's why the importance of having a kind of a rainy day fund or a financial buffer just in case something happens, because many, I suppose, higher earners, they can be negatively impacted by things such as bereavement or divorce or illness, and that can have, quite a severe impact on their financial well-being.
Yeah. So the hub, it sort of signposts some of the things we've talked about. It gives you more information on some of the things we've talked about and how people can access them. And you're going to add to it as time goes on.
Yes, I mean, as you said, people keep asking about, well, what are the tax implications? Which, whilst it's quite interesting, actually would make quite a dull podcast. Quite a dull,
and all changing, seeing as we had a mini budget last week, didn't we? So it's
it keeps changing as well. So for instance, earlier I just talked about perhaps using the employer national insurance contributions that you were having to spend. Now you don't. Perhaps you could use that money for pay or benefits or something else to improve employee financial well-being. And who knows what may happen in the future. I mean, it's pretty fast-paced moving, and today, today the 26th, we're already talking about whether the Bank of England may have to increase interest rates again, make an emergency increase.
Yes, it's quite frightening, isn't it? On that cheerful note, we'll hope that that's not the case, so we'll pause there. But Charles, thank you so much for coming on the HR Uprising podcast. I'll put links to the blog and to the hub in the show notes for this, so that people can go and actually take advantage of all that research that CIPD have done for them. Thank you so much.
Great, excellent. Thank you very much. And there are positive opportunities out there, for employers that actually do try and do something, or show they do something, or actually just are empathetic and kind, obviously are going to do better than those organizations that actually don't.
Absolutely.
Show kind of indifference.
Even just talking to people about it, it's important, isn't it, to show that, to show empathy for the position that people are in.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the irony is that just as we hit a cost of living crisis, many businesses are also talking about the cost of doing business. Yeah. So many of their own costs have gone up at a time, at the same time. So again, it kind of limits their opportunities for how they can support their staff.
Yes.
But we're still encouraging organisations and HR teams to kind of say, well, what's the problem? How what actions can we take within our organisation to let people know that we're trying to help them, and also we may have something already in place which could help them, but we need to kind of communicate it to employees and let them know what we already have.
Yes. And as you said, we've been through a sort of one crisis in terms of the health, and the whole COVID thing meant we had to work closely with employees. It was much more about a sort of a closer teamwork, I think, in thinking about well-being and people's physical well-being. Now it's about working closely and sort of being open and sharing about the financial well-being and the challenges for both the businesses and the individual. So it's challenging.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's how the CIPD started off 100 years ago. We were the Welfare Association because our focus was on employee welfare. And perhaps what's happened during the COVID and now the cost of living crisis, we have seen a return to a focus on employee welfare.
Wow, that's an interesting fact. And that's a great one to end on. So, Charles, thank you so much.
Another opportunity for a podcast.
Indeed. Thank you. I really hope you found this week's episode useful and enjoyable. If you did, perhaps you could recommend us to a friend or colleague, or give us a review on your platform of choice. It really helps new listeners to find us. Now you can access links to any of the information mentioned in this show via the website www.hruprising.com. Further free resources are also available at www.actus.co.uk. There you can also find out more about our software and training solutions. Finally, why not join our LinkedIn group, the HR Uprising, to share ideas and collaborate with other like-minded people professionals. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast.